Hello, world history students. Today is the last lecture in world history, and this is Unit 12, Part 5. It's really about decolonization in Asia, and then also, especially in Africa, and also about the Middle East, and then a little bit about Latin America as well. It's kind of a grab bag of all kinds of different topics. First of all, when we're talking about the Indian subcontinent, you might remember that Britain controlled India, and by India we mean a whole bunch of different countries on the Indian subcontinent. And this had gone back to really the 1800s when the British kind of took India over piece by piece. The British East India Company actually took it over first, and then the Indians rebelled with the Great Mutiny or the Sepoy Rebellion. Well, the Indians wanted to not be controlled by the British, and over time they were arguing for autonomy and independence. By 1937 or so, India had achieved self-rule, rule themselves, but they're still overall controlled by Britain, and they wanted total independence. Now, the Indian National Congress is the mostly Hindu group that was pushing for independence, and then there was also a Muslim League that was struggling for independence. And these two are, when they have the same goal, they're on the same side, and they're both against the British. But as you'll see, as the British let India go or quit India, then these two different groups were fighting against each other. And actually, in 1947, during World War II, 1939 to 1945, India helps Britain against the Japanese, helps Britain against Nazi Germany to some extent, in return for promises that India will be completely independent after World War II. That happens after World War II. Britain is really unable to continue to rule over India. They have their own problems at home. They're out of money. They're trying to fix their own country after World War II. And so they just give up on India. They basically quit it. And don't really leave the Indians with a kind of stable exit. They don't leave and then kind of stick around and help them achieve and the Muslim and Hindu and even Sikh people in the Indian subcontinent struggled with one another. The Muslims are a minority, and they were worried that the Hindu majority would try to rule over them and not give them their equal rights and things like that. And so really what happened was a partition or a separation or a breaking up of the Indian subcontinent. Basically, the center was mostly Hindu, and then the peripheries in the west and east were Muslim states. And when this started to happen, it meant that people who were living in the periphery, who were Hindu, left because they were fearful for their lives, and some of the Muslims who lived in the center moved to the east and the west. It was really a terrible thing that happened. About 10 million people relocated, and during that relocation, somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million people died, killing each other over sectarian violence or religious violence. Once people had moved to majority states, then it kind of settled down a little bit. But it was a really terrible thing that happens around 1947. It's also at this time, by the way, that Gandhi is killed. Gandhi wanted Muslim people, Sikh people, and Hindu people to live peacefully together, but a Hindu extremist, somebody who was like Gandhi, a Hindu, believed that this was the wrong course of action and shot him to death, assassinated the guy who was all about peaceful protest. It's very sad. Well, in the Indian part, the majority Hindu, but there are also a number of Sikhs, and there are also a number of Muslim people who live in India. It flourished as a democracy, and today it's the world's largest democracy in terms of population. And the democracy flourished under the leadership of a guy by the name of Nehru and his daughter Indira Gandhi. Both of them, or Nehru was, as I said, part of the Indian National Congress, who wanted to break away from Britain, and he is the leader of India. He dies, his daughter takes over, Indira takes over, and continues that family tradition of ruling India. There's some other people with the last name of Gandhi, by the way, no relation to the famous Mahatma Gandhi, but nonetheless, the Gandhi family were a big political family in India. So they made some agricultural advancements. There was a kind of green revolution that happened. They learned to farm using pesticides and fertilizers and new kinds of seeds and so on, and they're able to overcome the starvation that used to happen in India really quite frequently. Increased amounts of food leads to better health, and really an exploding population. There are more than 1 billion people who live in India today, and sadly, along with lots and lots of people comes a lot of poverty. There's still a lot of remnants from that caste system that we looked at way at the beginning of the year, where there are, not so much Brahmin and untouchables, but there are definitely different social classes or castes throughout India, and that matters a whole heck of a lot. And a lot of people at the bottom are really, really quite poor. And one of the things that people talk about too with India is really there is not many people don't have access to actual flushable toilets, and so this is just a big problem that they have to overcome. The religious conflicts between Hindus and Muslims and Sikhs within India continues to cause problems from time to time. Even today, sometimes people go rioting in one another's neighborhoods. Indira Gandhi herself was assassinated after she ordered some of her troops to attack the holiest site of the Sikhs, this Golden Temple, and they did that. They thought that there were terrorists who were hiding out there, or that they were storing arms there, and so on. But what she failed to do then was to remove her bodyguards, who were Sikh people, and those Sikhs were so angry at her attacking the Golden Temple that they shot her to death. They assassinated her a number of years ago. So that still flares up from time to time. Meanwhile, Pakistan, there was a West Pakistan and an East Pakistan, both of them Muslim majority states. They fell into a civil war. The folks in the East didn't want to be controlled by the people in the West. India gave aid to the people in the East Pakistan, and eventually the East Pakistanis became their own country called Bangladesh, which is, once again, it's a country that it's a majority Muslim country, but it's also a country with astounding poverty and astounding numbers of people. In West Pakistan, or just what we call Pakistan nowadays, there have been decades and decades of military coups controlled by military leaders and generals and so on, and instability. They also were responsible for supporting the Taliban when the Taliban was next door in Afghanistan. The Pakistanis and the Indians don't like each other. They are frequently almost going to war over a place called Kashmir, or sometimes they actually do go to war. This could be a very, very dangerous situation because India researched and developed atomic bombs or nuclear weapons, and the Pakistanis did likewise. So they both have some number of nuclear weapons that they could launch at each other. Once again, maybe there's a kind of a mutually assured destruction that keeps them from actually going to war with nuclear weapons. But let's hope that that continues, and we'll see what happens with the Indian subcontinent here in the future. In Africa after World War II, there were a whole bunch of new nations that were created. In fact, what you saw happening was that African nations were breaking away from their imperialist conquerors. You might remember we did this simulation with the imperialism, where you were choosing African territories to take over as a European state. Well, World War II weakens European states to the point where they can't really keep control over Africa. Also, they were telling African people that they knew better. There was this thing called white man's burden, where they thought that white men had to go all over the world and teach people how to be. Well, then these European people had these world wars that really kind of called into question, do European people actually know how to live? Are they actually civilized people? They slaughter each other in these horrific ways. And so people in Africa started to want to break away from control by Europeans, and they started to do that. There was also something called the Negritude movement, and that was a kind of nationalism or a kind of pride in all things African against the European colonial masters. There was great things that happened in African history. People who had African culture had a lot to contribute in terms of how people should live and what they should believe and so on and so forth. And they started to take pride in that. And that gave people in Africa a sense of knowing better than the people in Europe, and so they started to break away. One place where this was successful and really quite nice was in the country of Ghana, and in Ghana you have that gentleman right there, Kwame Nkrumah, who was kind of like an African Gandhi in a way. He wanted peaceful change. He wanted to break away from Britain in a peaceful way, and advocated for that, and the British were willing to do that, just like they did with India. And this is the first new nation in sub-Saharan Africa in breaking away from the Europeans, and it really gave other nations in Africa or other people in Africa the desire to have their own nation as well. A place that the British controlled too, where it was a little bit more difficult, was a place that becomes known as Kenya. I think at one point in time it was called British East Africa, but there was a guy by the name of Jomo Kenyatta. You can see that they kind of named that after him, and there was a group called the Mau Mau rebels who were fighting for independence against British settlers or white people who owned much of the land in Kenya and had all of the power in Kenya. And so these Mau Mau rebels, or Native African people, were fighting against the British. The British brought in the army and tried to keep them under control, but in the end the British saw that they didn't have the resources, they didn't have the will to keep the people under control, and a Kenya is born. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, you might remember Congo was a place that the Belgians controlled, and they were just really pretty horrible to the people there. This country is in the center of Africa, and it frees itself from control by the Belgians. It's called different things from time to time. It's called either Zaire or nowadays the Democratic Republic of Congo. There was a guy by the name of Mobutu Sese Seko who brought independence from the Belgians, but then became a kind of dictator. And actually that happens quite frequently. People who break away from their European conquerors oftentimes become then dictators over their own people. It's really kind of sad. Algeria, for those of you who speak French, Algeria was a part of France, more or less. It was a French colony, but then there were also about 1 million white French people who had settled in Algeria going all 1830 or so. After World War II, the Algerians wanted freedom. They wanted to not be controlled by European people. The Algerians are North African Muslim people, and they wanted to have their independence from the French and wanted the French to go home. So they fight a kind of civil war or war against the white French people who lived there. And the French tried to keep Algeria under control. But in the end, the French too saw that people who are in the vast majority, who don't want to be controlled by a small minority, are going to win their independence eventually. And that's what happens. Algeria becomes an independent state. Those white people moved back to France from where they came or where their ancestors came from. And then quite a few North Africans also left Algeria and started settling in France. A pretty big North African population in France today. South Africa is an interesting story. We saw some videos or I guess a documentary on guns, germs, and steel about South Africa and about the Boers who were going against the Zulu people in South Africa. And you might remember too that Britain and the white people in South Africa, these Boers, fought a couple of wars actually, and then at the end of those wars, then British white people and the Afrikaners, these Dutch white people, got together to create a government where white people were in charge and where the native black people had really no power and really no economic hope or chances either. And they really based everybody's civil rights on race, and they created this system called apartheid. You can see the word apart in that, and it's basically a kind of segregation with a white minority having all the power and all the property and all the really nice parts of the country ruling over a non-white majority of people, oftentimes Native African people living in gigantic slums or ghettos and working just for the white people. The group that wanted to change that was called the African National Congress, or the ANC. They were fighting for many, many years for equality between black people and white people, and they were led by Nelson Mandela. Nelson Mandela was accused of terrorism and thrown into a notorious prison where he spent many, many years. and was just there for a long period of time. Meanwhile, people within South Africa, native African or black Africans, were protesting and rioting, and eventually started to boycott the white government and the white economy, so to speak. And people all over the world looked at this racist country and started to side with the native African people or the black people and started to boycott South African products as well. This weakens apartheid, and it leads finally to the white minority government giving in and allowing free elections to take place, in which kind of a crazy thing happens. Nelson Mandela, ex-prisoner who was freed, it was elected the first black president of South Africa. And it becomes then a state where people are politically equal, but economically, you can imagine that that a lot of people of color are still really not doing as well as the white people in South Africa. Well, going on with the Arab-Israeli conflict, and then really talking a little bit about the Middle East, what you should know is that Jewish people throughout Europe had been persecuted for many, many years. It seems like things were getting better over time, but then the Holocaust happened, and the Holocaust really convinced a lot of Jewish people that they were never going to be safe in Europe or other parts of the world, and they needed to have their own country. And there were a number of Jewish people who were living in Palestine, which was controlled by the British after World War II and during World War II. And the United Nations was created. It really wanted to give Jewish people a place to live, and so came up with a plan to split Palestine into an Arab Palestinian part and an Israeli Jewish part. And Israel liked this plan, or the Jewish people who lived there liked this plan, and they simply declared themselves a country in 1948, and this sparked an immediate war between Palestinian Arabs and then a whole bunch of other Arab people, Jordanians and Syrians and Egyptians and so on, who wanted to support their brother Arabs, the Palestinians. So Israel's created in 1948, and then an Arab-Israeli war breaks out. The Arabs try to take over all of the Israeli or Jewish-held territory, and they fail. The Jews fight back. They didn't want another Holocaust to happen, and they're able to win that 1948 war. And then a whole bunch of more wars follow in 1956 and 1967 and 1973. And they're always pretty much the same. That is to say, there's a coalition or a group of Arab states that are attacking Israel and trying to wipe it out, and the Israeli people fight back and are able to win each and every one of those wars. And every time they win a war, they seize more and more territory that used to be held by Arab people. And so nowadays you have an Israel that has taken over quite a bit of land from other states. Some of the land that they've taken over, like that part there, the West Bank, and then the Gaza Strip, that green part, they have a large number of Palestinians who live there, and the Israelis kind of control them from outside the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And then too, there's a lot of settlers, Israeli settlers or Jewish settlers, who are settling in the West Bank and taking land away from the Palestinians. And the Palestinians fight back to the best that they can. They do this with what the Israelis call terrorism, bombings and firing rockets and running buses into people and things like that. And so the Palestinians are trying to gain their own state, a Palestine, through terrorism, through something called intifadas or uprisings or revolts that happen from time to time in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip. And Israel is able to kind of keep control of those territories time and time again. This makes Israel really unpopular with many parts of the world who look at the Palestinians as kind of victims. Other people view the Palestinians, as I say, as a group of people who are supporting terrorism against Israel and have more sympathy for Israel. But it's a very sticky situation even today, and who knows how it'll ever possibly be solved, because essentially it's a very small place, and both Arab Palestinians and Israelis want the same land, and so there's just not enough land to go around. Iran and Iraq are two places that have been appearing in the news for the last, I'd say about 40 years or so in the United States. And a lot of this has to do with, especially in Iran, a conflict between people who are more religious and people who are more secular. And what's happening throughout the Middle East, or what happened throughout the Middle East, is it's chock full of oil, and that oil was sold to Europeans and Americans, and a lot of money was made. And the governments of Middle Eastern countries sometimes spend that money on their people, and then sometimes on themselves. They don't really care too much about the people, and sometimes they just spend it on their militaries and then go to war with other states. Well, the United States, in the case of Iran in particular, was supporting the Shah of Iran, who was a secular leader over an Iran that was buying a lot of our products and buying a lot of our military equipment. We supported him. He was not a nice guy. He's kind of a dictator, and the people who were much more religious, people who wanted to not have Western morality and American civilization kind of dominating in Iran. People like the guy there on the left, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, they overthrew the Shah in 1979. And in fact, because we supported the Shah and continued to support him, they hated the United States. They took American hostages from the American embassy in Tehran, which is really a big no-no in the diplomatic world. But they took these American people hostages and held them for a crazy amount of time, hundreds and hundreds of days in the late 1970s. The United States then really hated Iran because of that, and was always looking for ways of standing up to Iran or damaging Iran. This continues on to today. You can hear about this from time to time. The United States is really quite worried about Iran getting nuclear weapons, and we're always trying to prevent that. There was a war between Iran and Iraq starting, in the 1980s. And at that period of time, the United States supported Saddam Hussein, supported Iraq because we hated Iran so much. And this was a really nasty war. The Iran-Iraq war lasted a good 7 or 8 years, and it was kind of like World War I, where there were trenches and charges of people and poison gas, and it was really a terrible conflict. A lot of Iranians and Iraqis lost their lives in this, and it ends up basically in kind of a draw. Later on, Saddam Hussein was interested in increasing his oil supply. He invaded Kuwait. Kuwait was a friend of the United States, and so the United States counter-invades. They invade Kuwait. They invade Iraq as well. And the first time they invade Iraq, they just pushed the Iraqis out of Kuwait, and then kind of went back. Saddam Hussein was still in charge, and then there was a second invasion after 9/11. It was thought that Saddam Hussein, who by the way had nothing to do with 9/11, but it was thought that he had weapons of mass destruction, and he might want to turn them over to terrorists, or he might want to damage the United States in some way. And so there was a kind of invasion that happened. And this time Saddam Hussein was toppled, and the United States took control of Iraq. In Afghanistan, which is not really in the Middle East, it's kind of in the South Asia. It's above India. It is above Pakistan. There was an interesting thing. Sorry, my dog. There was an interesting thing that happened in 1979 or so. The USSR. Hang on. Look. My dog gets really upset about Afghanistan. But the Soviet Union was supporting a communist government, if you might remember, against Islamic revolutionaries. And these are people who are kind of fundamentalist Muslims. They're people who have their own interpretation of the Quran and want to go back to a period of time which is centuries ago, and kind of put women under control and stuff like that. Anyway, these Islamic revolutionaries were fighting against the Soviet Union, and so the United States supported them. It's kind of part of the Cold War. It's a proxy war, and this becomes the Soviet Union's Vietnam. A lot of Russian troops die in Afghanistan. It's a place that where fighting is common. People like to fight, and they're really pretty good at fighting in their home turf, kind of like the Vietnam War for the United States. And eventually then the Soviet Union pulls out of Afghanistan, and that meant that this group of fundamentalist Muslim people, like I said, who want to live like it's the ninth century or whatever, took over this group called the Taliban. And this Taliban was already angering the international world by doing things like blowing up giant Hindu statues of Buddha that were sort of world treasures that were in Afghanistan, or by beheading people and chopping people's hands off, all kinds of things like that in a kind of medieval justice system. But the final straw was when the Taliban was supporting a terrorist group that was responsible for 9/11, Al-Qaeda. And that's where Al-Qaeda had its training bases, in Afghanistan. And so after 9/11, the United States told the Taliban, this government in Afghanistan, that they had to get rid of the Al-Qaeda terrorist camps. And the Taliban said no, that they were much more on the side of Al-Qaeda than they were on the side of the United States. And so the United States ended up invading Afghanistan and occupying Afghanistan, and then experiencing a kind of almost like when the Soviet Union invaded, maybe more successful in terms of not losing a whole bunch of troops, but this fight has been going on since basically 2011, and so this is the longest war that the United States has ever been in, and we're just not sure how to get out without letting the Taliban come back. And the Taliban is still committing pretty outrageous acts of bombing innocent people and doing stuff like that. So who knows where that's going to end up? It's just kind of a sticky situation. We're going to end this lecture, we're going to end the year, in fact, talking about Latin America. And I think we talked a little bit about Latin America breaking away from Spain way back when. And sadly, Latin America for a long period of time struggled for stability because, they really didn't have the factors that made democracy possible. For example, there weren't a lot of people who had the education to be informed citizens, and there's large numbers. Well, there's small numbers of really wealthy people and then large numbers of very poor people. And the wealthy people don't want the poor people to be educated and participate in democracy. They'd rather just, control those people. And so there's a lot of dictatorship that goes on in Latin America for a long period of time. So there's no equality in rights. There's no openness. There's no rule by law. It's really a lot of dictators over a long period of time and controlled by the military. So this really didn't work out too well in Latin America for a long period of time. Talk about three countries in Latin America or South America. Brazil, for example, it's the largest country in South America. It's got the biggest population in South America. You might remember people there speak Portuguese because it was founded by Portugal. And it was ruled by dictators in the military really up until about the 1980s. And economic problems finally just forced some reforms leading to democracy. There are a lot of very poor people there, and there are a lot of middle-class people and wealthy people as well. But it's still a place that has some problems fully reaching democracy and really fully having kind of economic fairness between people. In Mexico, our neighbor to the south, it's stable for most of the 1900s, but usually it's just ruled by one political party called the PRI, and oftentimes it acts harshly. Mexico has had some real problems with drug cartels, as you might know, and it also has an economy that really doesn't provide jobs for many of its citizens, and so a lot of people end up immigrating to the United States where they can be more successful. More recently, there was a rule by a different political party other than the PRI that was kind of nice, and it seems like Mexico is moving to be a more democratic state too, and we can only hope that their economy improves and then becomes something that is good for everybody. Argentina too, kind of like Brazil down there in South America, was ruled by a popular dictator. and a guy by the name of Juan Perón, and then it was ruled by the army for a while until about 1983 or so. Now it's a free democracy. It too, though, faces tough economic problems and just has a hard time providing enough for all of the people who are not having problems, um, you know, with having a stable currency and things like that. In general, though, all of these states came from, let's say, less democratic and maybe more unfair economies, and they're starting to move, and this is a great thing, they're starting to be more democratic and economically more successful. Well, that's it for the lecture, and I hope that you enjoyed it. Thanks so much, and go and do the Kia quiz associated with it. Thanks. Bye bye.